Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen? And you hear me? All right. All right, awesome. Thank you. All right, let's get going. All right, welcome everybody. Let's see where we left off last time. So last week we wrapped up most of the static content development that we've been covering throughout the last, say about a month or so, and where we discussed how to use HTML and CSS to implement mostly static pages, web pages, right? And we did have a little bit of dynamic content in that we could declare web pages to respond, to be responsive to the various screen sizes, right? So that things maybe that didn't fit could disappear, right? And other things could expand and take up their space, right? Like that, depending on the size of the screen, we could have the screen reconfigure itself, right? Different layout so that we can target various types of devices, right? From very large screens to monitors, right? Or laptops or iPads or even phones, right? So that's what we've been discussing, right? First, use HTML to get a rough a layout of the content that we want to display, right? Headings, paragraphs, lists, tables, and also some of the rough navigation between multiple screens. And then we revisited with the CSS to make it look more professional, and using Bootstrap that introduced several widgets, right, that made it easy to implement drop downs or a grid system, right, to lay out the content, be responsive and hide and show things, and how it gave us a consistent look and feel. We learned how to override that so that we could make it more customized to our own particular requirements. But for the most part, all this content was static, and we saw that there is a huge challenge, right? Where we had to have a lot of content that had to be copied and pasted over and over, right? It was very, very tedious. Late last week, we discussed the fact that we could use JavaScript as an alternative, right? That would allow us to encapsulate content, that we could now apply many software engineering principles, such as modularity, reusability, right? Create components, parameterizing content, right? And we could write algorithms and use classes and some very modern techniques, right, for reusing code, right? So from now on, right, until for the remainder of the semester, we're going to be using JavaScript as the programming language of the web, right? So we had a small sneak peek late last week. But today we're going to revisit this in earnest. Right? We're going to introduce the React JavaScript library, which is it's a formal a library or framework, right, that encapsulates several of the ideas that we introduced last week of encapsulating content, that you could parameterize it, that it could calculate the content, and it could calculate what the HTML and the DOM, right, that was going to be rendered on the screen, right? So React.js is one of the more popular UI rendering libraries out there, right? And we're going to be learning all about it in the next month or so. I mean, we're going to continue using it throughout the semester, but the next month is going to be dedicated just React.js. Okay. So today we're going to introduce the third assignment. There have been received some feedback on perhaps some of the earlier assignments was a little bit overzealous or ambitious. So I've reworked a little bit to make some of the content optional or for extra credit, as well as a lot of the new content has more hand-holding, right, and more examples of code snippets, right, that you could just copy and paste and it just works, right? And so that you can take it and then build on that, right, whatever else you want to create, right? So we'll introduce React.js today, this week, and so we'll learn how to instead of copying and pasting, right, content, we're going to learn how we can encapsulate that content, create components on it, reusable components, as well as get into the attitude of having our application be data driven, right, where we have all sorts of data structures, right, that we can use that can then be converted, right, into or computed, right, into a user interface. So basically that's what React.js is, right? It's a function that does a transformation from some data structure, right, and then it computes a user interface out of that data structure. And you have to create, your job is to create that function that does the transformation, right, from the data structure into an equivalent user interface. Obviously, there's all sorts of criteria and choices of how is it that you want to represent that user interface, from a particular data structure. There's no one-to-one, right? But there are some patterns that we can use, and then some best practices we can think of, right? So that's going to be the focus of this the next couple of weeks. Then we're going to talk about, that data that we are representing as a user interface. Well, that data can change over time, right? As users type data or click on with their mouse and drag and drop, or right, or they go out to a server, or some various events can occur that can modify the data structure, and then the user interface has to represent that new state, right? So the state of the application can change over time, as you add content, remove, update stuff, click here, drag there, type something. And so you are modifying that data structure in real time, right? And the user interface has to reflect that new state of the application. So that would be the focus in the next then in a couple of weeks, right? We'll talk about Redux, use state, use effect, right? All the hooks that go along, maintaining, manipulating, updating state, right? As well as encoding state in the URL. Okay. So anyway, so that's the plan for the next month or so. We do have a quiz later this week, right? It'll be available, I believe, on Thursday. Quiz 2, and that will be all about CSS. And as the quiz that you've taken already, right? All my quizzes are about showing you a small little snippet of code, right? And I ask you to fill in the blanks to fulfill a particular behavior or some task, right? So that's going to be also CSS as well. I'll give you a code snippet of CSS, a little bit of HTML, right? And then ask you, hey, what do I do if I want to change the foreground to green and the background to yellow, right? And you have to fill in the blank for that. Okay, so that's later this week. Also, the assignment the due date for the assignment was moved to Wednesday. Looks like quite a few folks were traveling for conferences and whatnot, as well as the assignment being fairly challenging. All right. Okay. Any questions? Let's clarify. We'll have our canvas done in A2 in order to start A3, since most of A3 are built on A2. Yes. Yeah. So we're going to take the whatever you've done on A2, right? And we're going to identify snippets, right? The various components, such as which were already introduced in assignment 2, such as the canvas navigation, the course navigation, the modules, right? So all these will become components, right, in assignment 3. Right? We're gonna take the HTML that you wrote, right, and we're gonna wrap it inside of a function, right, and into a JavaScript function, and that will become a component, right? And following some of those techniques that we discussed late last week, like we were using strings, right? And so in React.js, you'll notice that it has a very similar syntax that you should be able to recognize, but it uses a language called JSX that simplifies what we were trying to do last week. Last week was all about strings, concatenation strings, and whatnot. But here, using JSX, it tries to blur the line between the JavaScript world, right, and the HTML world, right? Because last week, the reason we were using strings is that we were just basically in JavaScript, right? And the only way that JavaScript could generate HTML was by writing strings, right, and concatenating strings. And that's very error prone. So what JSX addresses, right, is the no need for the distinction of when you are in JavaScript or when you are in HTML. It's kind of all blend in all in one in this new language called JSX. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the assignments, right, in particular the assignment 3, right, to discuss about JavaScript, functions, spreader, JSON, all the various topics of JavaScript. I'm going to address them, as I discuss the third assignment, right? I will demonstrate the various exercises, and I will pause in each one of the exercises and discuss the concept or the feature, or where is this useful, right, for each one of the various capabilities of JavaScript. Okay, this is also captured in the slides, which you're welcome to take a look at that. But I'm going to address as the assignment. Also, I'm going to follow the assignment as close as possible. So the resulting code, right, is me having completed the assignment, right, or a fair amount of it. So to address some of the complexity in the assignments, you're welcome to take that code as yours, right, and for your own assignments, right? So you might want to wait getting started on assignment 3. It's going out today or yesterday, but you're welcome to copy the files and whatnot from my Git repository. Right? So I think that should give you a leg up, a booster on getting you going with the assignment. Okay. All right. Yeah. So let's get going. All right. So yeah. So let's take a look at the third assignment, right? And I will introduce React.js and talk about JavaScript, right, as we are working through the assignment. So let's open it up. Okay, so one of the aspects of React.js is that is referred to as a single page application framework, right? Or it's a library to easily build single page applications, right? Or SPAs. And so the question, well, what is a single page application? In prior to single page applications, the normal mechanism for navigating between or building large applications was to you have a screen, right, and a web page, and so that if you wanted to navigate somewhere else, right, you would click on the hyperlink, and what would happen is that the old screen was removed, right, and replaced by a new one, right? If you notice, if you inspect, right, you look at the network, if I navigate, right, there's a brand new set of requests that go out, right? The old HTML document is dumped, and new one is fetched from the server and replaces the old one. Okay. So that's how most of all the web content is, right? Especially if it's static HTML like this. Now, when you have dynamic content, right? If you go to your slides, right, in Google, so this is not a multi-screen application. This is a single page application, right? In the sense that you have this screen, it loads a single HTML document, right? And then it uses JavaScript to then compute and render all this content, right? It goes out to a database, right, and fetches the content, the list of all my slides, right, and then renders that data structure here. And then when you click on a particular component, there was no navigation here. It's not like it dumped the old HTML document and then it went out to the server to then replace the content with this new HTML. Instead, again, it used JavaScript to kind of like clear the canvas, right, and then redraw this whole thing, this new content based on, right, and on some path parameters or things like that, right. So it is computing. It is always in the same HTML document, right? And instead, it's using JavaScript to draw more things, to erase the screen and redraw something, and you can still looks like you're navigating, right? You're navigating to different slides here, but what it's doing, right? It's going out to some database, fetching the content, right, and then pumping it into here, right? Same thing with Google Maps, right? Google Maps is also another example of a single page application, right? Where, right, when, as you scroll, it's going out to a server to fetch data, right, and fill in the blanks of the world, right? As opposed to older implementations of MapQuest, which is still around, but they changed their implementation, right? But it used to be that MapQuest was not a single page application. It used to be that you had buttons above and below and on the right and the left, and as you clicked, right, you didn't have this nice smooth dragging before, right? Now it's a single page application, but way back when, 20 years ago, or however many years ago, they had buttons, right? You would click the button, right, and it would render the entire screen with the image slightly moved to the left, to give you the sensation of panning right or left, right? But it was a very jarring experience, right? The whole thing would render. It was like a flicker. You would have an ugly flicker. It's not what happens if you're going through Wikipedia, right? But most of the time it doesn't really matter, because you are replacing the entire screen with some brand new content, which makes sense if you're navigating from one static content to another static content. But something that barely changes, right, like Google Maps, where this doesn't change, the top doesn't change, right, only the main content, right, here is very smooth. You can only do that with a single page application. So React.js is known to be a nice, well thought out, mature library for creating single page applications, right? Okay, and I'm all about acronyms, right? So that definitely is going to be on one of my quizzes. What does SPA mean, right? So we're asking you to now focus on building single page applications using React. So what we're going to do is that we're going to take the code that we've already built for the assignment. And if you remember, we kind of broke it, right, so that we can focus on just HTML and CSS, right? So what we did back then, right? We right, if I run this npm start, so this is rendering the HTML, right? The index.html with the various assignments, the canvas application, right? The CSS lecture, blah, 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 right? And so this is using the old navigation mechanism, right? Which is fine. And so it's starting here in this index.html, right? In the public directory index. And we have the hyperlinks to the lectures and the canvas and whatnot, okay? And so what we did is that we noticed here there was a div ID root, right? That looks very familiar. I think we did some of that. We did work a little bit with that, and I gave you some examples on how we could, using the document, right, the browser's document object, to write or change the inner HTML and inject content in there, strings, right, that we can compute over time, right? So yeah, that was a very rough implementation of using strings, right? And much more modern implementation is to use React.js, right? So let's do that. We kind of have broken our application, right? So we're going to abandon our work that we did in index.html, right? So notice that it's gone, right? There's nothing there. It's not rendering anything. And kind of leave public all by itself for now, right? We're going to focus on the source directory. And under here, if you remember, there was an index.js. This was the entry point of that single page React application that we created using create React app, right? and we kind of broke it, right? We said, okay, we're not going to touch this for a couple of weeks, right? Well, we're going to bring it back. We're going to bring it back. We're going to uncomment it. I'm going to save it, and notice that, boom, we have our original React application, that we created about a month ago, right? So what is it doing? Well, it's this code is written in something that looks like JavaScript. This is definitely stuff that you can recognize as JavaScript. You have imports, you have constants, you have function calls, right? But wait a minute, there's a mixture here of something that looks like HTML, right? Something that looks like HTML. It's not a string, right? It's literally a tag, right? And and this is what I refer to as this new language called JSX, right? It's a mixture of JavaScript and XML, right? And it blurs the line between the two, right? The language tries to make it seamless to go from JavaScript into the XML syntax, then back to JavaScript, and then you can embed. So this is we're embedding HTML inside of JavaScript, but that's fine. Inside of this HTML, you can then embed more JavaScript, so you can go back and forth, right? And also it binds these tags, right, that look like XML. It binds them to JavaScript functions, right? So this app here, this app tag, well, that's definitely not HTML tag, especially this one. This is definitely not HTML tag, right? So basically, this app is really this variable here that we are importing from where? From this file, right? This file right there, this app.js is this app, right? In JSX or in JavaScript in general, the extension .js is optional, right? You don't need it, right? You can put it in, but you don't need it. And if you go into that app.js, this one right here, right, this is what's being rendered, right? It's a function that calculates some HTML-like content, and so JSX, what it does is it compiles or transpiles this so that this funny-looking tag references that function, calls it, invokes it, right? Invokes it, and whatever that function returns gets replaced in here. It's as if you could just copy this, right, and just paste it in here, right, and just replace that whole content. Make sense, right? There's a question on the chat. Let's see. Can you explain when do we use self-close tags and when we don't? Yes, good question. So for instance, what Tian is referring to is that this app, right, has what is called a self-closing tag. See that? And self-closing tag means that you do not have a body, right? You don't have any content between your opening and closing tag, right? So there's two syntax for a tag. You can have a tag here. Notice this tag has an opening and a closing. That means that in between there's something, right? There's content in between the opening and the closing tag. Then we call it the body, right? And so if you want to have a body or you need a body, you have to use a syntax where you have the opening and closing. But if you don't have any body, right, like app doesn't have a body, then you have to use the self-closing tag, right? For instance, it would be a syntactical error to just leave it like that, right, and not close it, right? You could use this. So this is an equivalent. You could do that, but there's no body in here, right? We could do that, but if you know that you're not going to have any body, right, you have a more compact version that you can do a self-closing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Okay. So yeah. So basically, this is as if we had JavaScript embedded instead of HTML, because basically this is a function that gets invoked, and whatever it returns, that's what we get. Okay. All right. A couple other things also. This has some styling, right? So we're going to remove that styling. It's going to look weird. Also, app.js has some styling. We're going to remove that as well. We don't need any CSS. And so now we lost our styling. Actually, we're going to just remove everything. We're going to remove everything, right? And replace it with just a hello world. Okay. And so now we just have a plain old heading 1 hello world, right? So we removed all the boilerplate code that comes when you install React.js and create an application. Okay. All right. Yeah. So we brought back the root, which we might have commented out in the previous assignments. We brought back the app, right? We're going to comment out the index.css, remove that, and we have our hello world. Okay. We're also going to install a Bootstrap and React icons. We already did install Bootstrap, but let me just make sure. I'm going to copy that and stop it and install it. I think we had already installed it. Now, in previous assignments, to bring in Bootstrap, right, we use the link, right, and we navigated to vendor, blah, 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 Bootstrap, whatever. Here, we don't need to do that, right? Bootstrap is already installed in Node. When you install it, right, it gets installed and copied into node_modules, right? And that's all. That it can stay that. There's no need to copy any of this content outside of node_modules. We can reference the content in here, right? And very easily you can import it by saying instead of doing link, right? We use the equivalent of using import, right? And to see an example, we can import a CSS which does a link. Right, the transpiler understands that JavaScript can be imported, but CSS means that in the DOM you have to create a link node, right, that connects to that CSS, and the rel is a style sheet, right? So we can do the same thing. Now this app.css, notice it says dot. See that dot means that it's in the current folder, right? So that notice that in app.js, right, we have an app CSS, right, and that's what we were loading, right, and it just has plain old CSS, right, no difference there. Okay, this would add the link in the header, right? So same thing here we're going to do with Bootstrap. So we say Bootstrap, but notice we're not going to say dot. If you use a dot in your import, then you're navigating the local file system, right, from where you are, right, from where this app.js is. Instead, we're just going to say Bootstrap. Yeah, I think that's correct. So because we didn't do dot, right, we're not navigating from our local file system. Instead, it reverts to looking in the node by default. It looks for node_modules. Like any library, right? All libraries that you install, right, would be installed inside of node_modules. And it treats Bootstrap the same way, right? Again, if you don't say /, if you say /, then it's a relative path, and it would look inside of the file system that you're in, right? Whereas if you don't say anything, then this will start looking inside of node_modules, and that's how it finds it, right? It finds Bootstrap by going into node_modules and finding and whatnot, right? So the question might be, says, wait a minute, why didn't we say when we were doing the public directory, when we were doing in the public, right? Why do we have to copy it into vendors or libs or whatever, right? Wasn't the server not allowed to navigate outside of the public directory and then go down to node_modules? That's true, right? If you're in an index.html, then yes, in the public directory, right, you cannot navigate up and then down to node_modules. This here, right, is not doing that. This is, again, all this code is transpiled, right? It's converted into a version, into a lower level version, right, of just plain JavaScript, right, where you can't do this, right? In plain JavaScript, that's not JavaScript, right? This is a new thing. It's a language that mixes and matches, JavaScript and HTML. It's not JavaScript. So this gets converted into a lower level JavaScript, right? So that transpiling mechanism goes and fetches this, right, where it actually is, and it creates a bundle, right, a deployable bundle, right? That it's not human readable, right? I mean, you could read it, but it's compiled, right? It has all sorts of additional optimizations and global variables and whatnot, right? Where the .css gets copied into that bundle, right, and then gets deployed as a single unit, right? But that gets done automatically. You don't need to do that, right? So yeah, so there's Bootstrap. And we're also going to install React icons. So this is kind of like font awesome on steroids, right? Let's install that. So React icons, right? If you go to React icons, okay, it's a library, it's a superset, right, of kind of like all the icons, right, and all in one single place, right? So you have font awesome, right? You have the Bootstrap icons plus tons of other libraries out there, right? And also they you don't use them like CSS libraries, using I or whatever. Instead, these are full-blown React.js components, right? You're going to use them using like a tag, right? And then you would use these names, right? So if you want that particular tag, you can just copy it, and you can use that name, and using an HTML tag with that name, and then it renders that icon, right? Which is pretty cool, right? So yeah, so we're gonna have that. We're gonna import it later on in the assignment. We can use those icons a little later. Okay, so that's let me run that again. npm start. Okay, and we now should be we should we have hello. Notice that it's applying the Bootstrap styling, right? It removes the padding all around, right? It's a new font. Okay, so yeah, so we can use it all throughout. Notice that it gets included from app.js. We can also put it actually. We could put it a better way. Put it maybe by here in index, right? Index. So this is loaded only once, right? No longer are we going to have to, import or link to the Bootstrap, in every HTML document, because there's only one document, right? This gets all bundled into one single deployable unit, right? It's one single JavaScript, which is doing something similar we were doing last week, right? It's grabbing the root, right, element from HTML, this root ID, this one, right? It's grabbing that, and it's going to inject content in there, but using a more sophisticated library, right? It grabs a reference to it, and then it renders. See that? It renders and injects this content in there. What content? Well, whatever app returns, and app returns just hello world. Okay, make sense? Yeah, please stop me, right, if I'm losing you. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so we have Bootstrap. So what we're going to do is that to practice React.js, we're going to have tons of small little exercises, right? And we're going to make them all into small components, right? And then we can take all these components and combine them into one big assignment, right? The assignment 3, right? And then we'll have Canvas as a separate component, and so on and so forth, right? At first, they're all going to render in one single screen, right? Together, all the assignments, the Canvas, everything's going to be in one single screen, right? Because we still have to learn how to navigate, right? No longer can we navigate with just having a hyperlink, right? Clicking that hyperlink and then going somewhere, right? Because there's nowhere else to go. Right? It's only one single page, right? That's why they're called single page applications. So we're going to have to reinvent navigation, right, using a different approach, right? So, and that's a little later in the assignment. Okay, so we're going to create a couple of placeholders, right, for each of the things that we're going to be building. Again, we're going to work all our work is going to be under the source directory. So when we create a couple of things here, we're going to have labs. That's where we're going to do all our labs, and we're going to do the Canvas in a separate directory. Okay. And then in labs, we're going to have several assignments, right? So we're going to do assignment 3 in here. We're going to have assignment 4, and so on and so forth, right? We're going to have several assignments in there. So this is A5, and so on and so forth, right? So for all the assignments all the assignments from now on, right, they're going to have it's going to be a separate component, right, for that particular assignment, right? And so under labs, also we're going to create an index.js, which is going to be the kind of like the introduction to all the labs, right? So we'll create a component here. We'll say, function, function, right? And this is labs, and we're going to return labs, right? And we're going to export labs. And then in app.js, we can then start importing those components in here that are going to be rendered into the root. All right. Now there is a difference in the syntax slightly from what we were doing last week and this week, right? So last week we were doing something like getting a parenthesis in here where we were using strings first of all, right? And say you had hello one, and say I wanted to now display now the labs, right? Which is rendered here, this labs. I would import it. I would say import labs. There it is. And then presumably I should be able to do something like this, labs, right? So this would be the components, as a tag that would invoke the labs function, and then it would render. But it's complaining about it. Say it doesn't like that. Right, this was totally fine if these were just a string, right? But these are components, right? And return can only return one thing, right? It could return labs or it could return h1, but not both. So the way to fix this is that we can wrap this inside of a div, right? That contains both of them, right? As if it were a single thing. So that's easy, right? We can just wrap this around with a div, right? And just have it like that, right? Then now it's fine, right? Return is returning just one thing that then it contains in its body, right, a whole bunch of other things, right? So there you have it, right? So you have labs like that, and so this should be rendered. This should be rendering. Index. Labs function labs. Huh? Cannot find file index.js does not match corresponding name in the disk. Oh, where did I put it? Oh, did I not? Labs, is it? Labs. Oh, sorry, I misspelled it. Yeah, capitalization matters here, right? So there we have it. We have labs, right, implemented in there. And same thing. I mean, we can have in Canvas, we can have an index in here, index.js, right, that returns the canvas. So canvas that returns canvas, and then we can export that. And in here we can just load that to canvas. That, and then it renders to hello world, labs, and canvas. Yes. So yeah. So for now, right, until we don't practice how to navigate from one place to the other, right, we can we're gonna have everything in one single screen, right? So okay, so you have labs. Labs is gonna have several assignments, right? It's gonna have one component for assignment 3, another component for assignment 4, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah, so labs could have some content for assignment 3. So maybe this would be h2, right? And then there would be maybe another one for assignment 4, right? And so on and so forth, right? Assignment 5. But instead of having all the experiments and in this one big labs component, again, React.js encourages you to break it out, break it out into a separate component, right? And do all the work there, and then encapsulate it with a function, and then call it here with a tag, right? You can encapsulate it with that. So in A3, for instance, we can create another file here. This would be index.js that has the assignment 3. So here we can maybe call it assignment 3, break it out into a separate component, right? Now we have assignment 3 in here, export this, and then in here, instead of having everything in one single place with the assignments 3, 4, and 5, we can break it out, right? And then in here, we can replace this with, assignment 3, like that, right? And we still have the same content. Probably one it is to be H2 instead, right? There we go, right? Same thing we would say for assignment 4, assignment 5, and so on and so forth. It would be in a separate file, right? And then we can deal with the complexity of that component, elsewhere in a different function, which is what you would normally do in any software engineering endeavor, right? You're always looking for opportunities, right, to break out, deal with the complexity, right? That's the whole point of object orientation, component-wise technology, right? Reusability, abstraction, all those best practices that you might have heard about. Most of them are criterias and know-how of how to deal with the ever-growing complexity, right? Things are kind of getting out of hand. It's getting too big to understand. Oh, break it out, right? Encapsulate it. Right? So I don't have to think about it so much, right? I can just think about a black box. I don't have to know the details. Yes. So yeah. So assignment 3. Let's see. So we have the labs, right? We have assignment 3. Now, assignment 3 itself could have maybe a container, right? If you want to bring in some of the, some of the rendering, because it's kind of like, it's kind of like a flush to the edges, and I don't like that. I really don't like that look and feel when it's so flush with the content. Canvas is fine because we actually need Canvas to be flush with the content, right? So I'm not going to put a container around that. But assignment 3, maybe even the labs, right, might be a good idea to just wrap this perhaps with a container, class, container. And so it adds that, it centers the content, right? Adds some margins all around. Okay. Let's see, assignment 3. Let me see, assignment 3. We broke out. Okay, we can break out the hello world as well, right? Instead of having this hello world here, it can be its own component too, right? So maybe you can have here a file called hello world.js, right? And then just cut it out of here, and then we can create a function called hello world, right? And the content was an H1, like that, right? And then we export it, and here we can just bring it back, right? Hello world. Okay. All right. So a word on the syntax here that I've been kind of using index.js sometimes, and I've been using files that actually have a name, kind of like interchangeably, right? So for instance, this one is index.js, canvas index.js, see that? Whereas this is an actual name for a component. This one says canvas, but I did not call it canvas.js, see that? Now, if I would have called it canvas.js, I would have ended up doing what? In my app.js, I would have ended up doing, canvas/canvas.js, right? Which that looks really weird. Instead, right, it's just canvas. And this is index. Since it has the special name of index.js, if here you don't specify an actual JavaScript file, right, it looks for an index.js in that folder. It assumes that, oh, it's a folder, right? It's not an actual file, it's a folder. So it will automatically load the index.js, right? Without you specifying, right? Without you specifying canvas, index.js, right? Right. That still works, but it's unnecessary. It's unnecessary. Okay. It understands that that is an index.js. And same thing for hello world. Instead, what we're doing is that we are here. We actually have a hello world.js, right? And it works just the same, right? But again, the JS doesn't matter. Now I could have, instead of doing canvas directory and then index.js, I could have had here, right, at the source, I could have an actual file called canvas.js, right, not inside of a folder. And this would have been the same import, the same exact import. See that? So the question is, well, when to use canvas.js or a folder with an index.js, right? Because they would have identical results, right, from the code, right? Well, the reason we would use the folder and file approach is if you intend for that canvas component to be so complex that you actually need a whole bunch of files to build canvas, right? If your component is simple enough that it's just a hello world, then yeah, so maybe it could just be that one single file and it has its name and you load that one file and you're done, right? But, right, and we know canvas is going to be not just one file, canvas.js, is going to be a whole bunch of stuff. So we're using the approach of creating a whole folder. We're creating the index.js for the canvas component. And then we're going to fill in here a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to bring over the course navigator, right? The canvas navigator. We're going to bring in the grades and dashboard. We're going to bring everything that we've done in the second assignment, right? We're going to wrap it inside of a function and bring it over. Okay. Right. So this directory is going to be fairly full of stuff, right? So that's why we went with the directory approach and then the index.js. Right, but later, much more later for canvas. Right? Okay. Yeah. So we did that. Hello world. We loaded hello world. We created a canvas placeholder. We loaded it up. Right. So we've set up, right? We have the application running, it's set up. And so now we're going to learn in section 2.2 is a very long section, and it's full of small little nuggets about JavaScript, right? It teaches some of the more mundane stuff that you already know about, like variables and data types, right? But it quickly builds up to some of the more interesting things, right? And it gives you a chance to practice creating components and importing them, right? And including them and then displaying them with some of the more simple stuff. And as you build up, right, I kind of start letting you go a little bit so that you can do it on your own, right? So I show you lots and lots of examples at first, right? And then slowly I kind of let go and says, okay, well, now you do it, right? So I just give you an idea and then you do it. But let's take a look at it, right? So we're going to practice a lot about JavaScript. We're going to learn about the language. So I'm going to create a component called JavaScript that is going to allow me to practice a lot of small little things about the JavaScript language, right? So let's create a component. So under the A3 directory, so I'm going to copy that. So under the A3 directory, right, we're going to create a so this would be a great question. Is, well, if the JavaScript is going to be a whole bunch of components, right? Why don't we create a folder and then drop in there all the exercises? Sure, that's a very good argument. But I'm not going to go through that. I'm going to create a file, right? And that file is going to include other files, right? So I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it JavaScript. And in there, I'm going to create a function of the same name, right? So JavaScript. And so I'm going to return JavaScript and going to export it. And then I'm going to bring it into my assignment 3 exercise. So this is going to be JavaScript. Okay. There we go. So we should see JavaScript there. Okay. And I guess this should be an A3. So it's getting smaller and smaller, right? There we go. JavaScript. So yeah, so we brought that in. So one of the most mundane things that you need to learn is that we can print, right, in the console, right? We can debug this, right, by going to the inspector, and as you're debugging, as you are implementing your components, sometimes they're not going to behave as you expect. So it's always useful to print something to the console, right, to see if it's behaving as expected, right? So this is just a small little blurb about writing to the hello world string from the JavaScript component, right? So outside of the return, right, in the body, right, you can do a lot of computation here, right, including just printing out stuff to the console. You can declare variables, you can declare data structures, right? Go out to a server, fetch data, blah, 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 right? And then render that content down below in the return, right? So if we do that, you'll notice that there it is, a hello world that gets printed from the console, right? So yeah, so let's keep going. Variables. So here's a little component that intends to introduce you to the fact that like any other language, right? JavaScript obviously has variables, right? So let's create us. I guess you can just copy this. You can just copy this, paste it. So this is so again, in the body of your function, right, before you do the return is rendering something, right? You're returning content that's going to be embedded or injected into the root, right, in the DOM for rendering. But before it gets rendered, right, you can do all sorts of computations. Right? And so here we're just declaring just a few variables. So there's three modifiers, right, or keywords for declaring variables. One is var. This is from way back when. It's a vestige from older days, which we don't use anymore. Var, right, which is it's scoped to the function, right? So this only it's somehow related to the function. We don't use this scope anymore. Instead, we now use let and const, right? Let declares a new variable that can change over time, whereas const declares a symbol, right, an identifier that can only be set at declaration, right, and then it can't change over time. Yes. Then here we are displaying the content, and so this obviously this is JavaScript, yes, and this looks like HTML, but it has embedded JavaScript expressions. See that those curly brackets? Those curly brackets are escape characters saying, hey, I want to replace this content with the value of that variable or constant, right? Whereas this is a literal string that gets rendered as is to the DOM. This is a reference, right? You are referencing a variable, and this whole thing gets replaced with the value of that variable, right? So like a dereferencing, in C, using the asterisk or something, right? So you dereferencing the value of that variable, right? And then you are replacing whatever that is in here, right? So anyway, so we have that component. Let's bring it into JavaScript, and let's do variables and constants. There we go. Okay. And I guess this should be H4, right? The sizes. It doesn't matter really. There it is, right? So we have those three variables rendered to the output, right, to the page. Okay, yeah, let's keep going. Data types, right? You have all the data types that you would expect in a mature language. Right? So let's create a new file, and let's put in there this content. And again, so we're declaring a couple of floating point values, numbers, strings, and then you can declare Boolean expressions, right, or Boolean variables, right, of type bool, right. Notice that there's no strong typing here. You're not saying that something is a number or floating point or string, right? JavaScript is entirely typeless, right? You have no types. The types are determined at runtime, right? So we know that this is a string type because we are assigning it a string literal, right? Same thing. These are types numbers, right? There is no floating point data type, right? Integers and floating points are both just type number. That's all. And then you have Boolean, right? Because we're assigning the keyword true. You can compute or ask a query, what is the type of each variable by using the type of operator, right? So this return is number, string, or Boolean, and the return is a string, right? The string, right? Or the string number, or the string function, the type object. So down below here, we are displaying the variable data types, right? What they are. So we are displaying the number variable, the floating point variable, and we are using BR, right, to break the lines in there, right? So we can bring this into our JavaScript exercise. I'm going to put it at the top. If I put it at the bottom, I'm going to have to scroll all the way at the bottom. It's annoying. So variable data types, variable. Wait, what did I call it? Not variable constants. What was the other one called? Variable types. That one. And so this is variable types. It didn't load it for me. So it's import variable type. There we go. And so let's render that. There it is, right? So we have numbers, Boolean is number, string, and Boolean. Okay. All right, so let's keep going. So Boolean variable. So okay, so here's an exercise where I don't create the function for you. It's not as easy as just copy and paste, right? So you have to do a little bit of thinking here, right? So we are going to create the file, right? That is going to illustrate how something about Boolean variables, right? But I'm going to have to create the function myself. So I'm not going I can't just copy and paste, right? So what's in there? The Boolean variables. This is just I'm still giving you the return though, right? So I'm doing some work for you. But in later exercises, I don't even do the return, right? I only do the computation. You know that you need to create the return, right? And add all the display stuff to display to the UI, right? So I'm gonna print that out. And don't forget, it needs to be exported, right? Don't forget about that. Yeah, so just declaring just a few variables, a few Boolean variables, and then calculating, right, the various Boolean operators such as and or and not, right? And so I'm computing new variables based on, right, operations on the other variables, and also some comparisons such as equal or less than or not equal, right? And you have all the other operations, greater than or equal, less than or equal, blah blah blah. All those are there as you would expect, okay? And they behave like you would expect, right? This is the Boolean and Boolean or, right, not equal, triple equal, right? Triple equal. Wow. That is different than equal, right? So there are three equal operators. There is the assignment equal operators, which assigns the right-hand side to the left side, right? Then there is the equal, right? That works most of the times, but sometimes it fails, right? Sometimes it fails. And the reason is that the equal will try to cast, right, one of the sides that you're comparing, right, will try to cast it to the other. So for instance, it'll try to cast either this character 1, it will try to cast it into the integer 1, or vice versa, it'll try to convert the integer 1 into a character 1 and then do the comparison. So if you're able to cast it, right, and then compare, then that's not really an equal, right? That's like a sort of equal. Yeah, it's I guess the character 1 is somewhat the same as the number 1, right? So that's why we never use this operator, right? Because it could run you into bugs that sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. Ooh, why? It's because of that, right? So instead we use the triple equal, right? Like we did here. Triple equal, what it does is that it first checks to see whether the two data types, right, on either end, if they're the same, right? If they are the same, then it goes on and does a comparison. If they're not the same, it doesn't even bother comparing and just returns false, right? So this is what you should use all the time, right? So this is not equal, right? So yes, it's true. I'm sorry, it's not true that character 1 is the same as triple equal to 1, right? But it is sort of true that character 1 is equal number 1, right? So anyway, so here I'm rendering it. Notice that the expression to render the variables, I mean, I am concatenating a string, right? And the reason is that the Boolean variables all by themselves don't render to the screen, right? They don't render. They don't have a string representation, right? So it's not even render on the screen. So what I'm doing here is that I'm making a little, expression that I am concatenating, the keyword, the value of true 1, I'm concatenated with strings so that it can be printed, right? So yeah, so let's import that into JavaScript. Again, I'm going to put it at the top, but you don't have to. You can put it at the bottom, like the assignment says. And there they are, right? So now it's printed, right? If we didn't convert it into a string, this would not have printed. So let's verify that. So for instance, in the Boolean variables, right? If I don't have this, notice that it doesn't display. See that? So I'm converting it into a string. I'm casting it into a string. All right. All right. So all these are pretty simple stuff, right? As an example, also I'm working with conditionals, like if else and ternary expressions and whatnot. So let's play around with if else. And this does what you would expect it to, right? So this is if else, right? And this is a function. So this is a function, if else, right? And then we have the body here. Let's copy the body, paste it in there. So it's declaring a couple of Boolean variables, right? If it's true, it's going to print it out to the console, right? And if it's not true, right, it's going to print one of these, right? And then here I am. Oops, is there an error? Oh, there we go. And don't forget to export. And so the point of this exercise is that we're learning here that content, right, can be toggled, meaning I can show some content or not show it based on the value of a Boolean variable, right? So by applying this AND operator, I can say that that this variable declares or controls whether the following content gets displayed or not, right? So true 1 is true, right? So we are going to render, right, the paragraph that has true 1. Now, if true 1 was false, then this content would not render, right? So that's a very common technique in React.js, right? To toggle content, right? That you show it if this is true, but not show it if it's not true, right? Another very powerful mechanism that's used quite a lot in React.js is to use a ternary operator, right? Where you have a question mark, right? That is evaluating a Boolean expression on the left of predicate. It's evaluating, it says, is this true or not? And then it has two possible outcomes, right? That are separated by this colon. It's saying, well, if this expression on the left side is true, then this whole thing is going to evaluate to the first of my options here. But if this is false, then this whole thing evaluates to the second, right, or the last portion, right, of this predicate, right, of this expression, right? Very powerful. So let's include this. So if else, so this is if else, there it is, and let's see how it renders. There it is, if else. So this is rendering because true is true. So say we could. So let me show you just with another. Say I had this paragraph, right? So I have a paragraph and I have lorem ipsum lorem. There it is, right? So say you it was a very long paragraph. Okay. So this is always displaying. but I can now toggle it, right, by putting in front of it, right? I can wrap it inside of an expression, and the expression just evaluates to that. So it's still there. But if I put true in front of it, and so true and something evaluates to the something, right? If that something is true, then it evaluates to true. If it evaluates to false, then it evaluates, the whole thing evaluates to false, right? So true now is controlling whether we display this paragraph or not, right? Which now it is rendering. But if I say false, right, the paragraph is no longer there. See that? So later on, we're going to learn, how can we control the value of that variable so that we can maybe toggle things on or off, or maybe it's a data structure, right? And depending on whether something's true or false, right, we show a check mark or we don't show the check mark, right? Based on some Boolean variable in some data structure, right? Or maybe it's like a to-do list, right? And the ones that are done, right, I don't show in the list, right? Maybe I show them elsewhere. Okay. So so this is true, where this variable is true, true one, I can say, this is true one, and then bring back that paragraph. See that? Okay. All right, so let's keep going. Yeah, so here's a little tiny exercise on the ternary operator. So let's create that like that. And then let's create a function. And not forget to export. And so here you have the body of the function. And let's put that in there. So this is using a variable that is initialized to true. Presumably, I'm logged in. I typed in my username and password correctly, and I'm logged in. And so we have a screen or component that says, "Hey, if you are logged in, I am going to greet you and say, hey, welcome." But if you're not logged in, if this is false, then I'm going to say, sorry, you have to log in, right? So this is kind of like revisiting the same idea here. So let's bring in the ternary operator example. And so it's welcoming me here because the value of logged in is true. But if it were false, I notice it says please log in. I think it would be useful if we have this like on the right-hand side, and we can see what we're doing, right? And this might be a little small like that, side by side, right? And so the right-hand side changes, as we work here on the left side. Okay. If I toggle this and I say true, right, this changes to welcome. See that? But if I change it to false, right, it goes back to please log in, right? So the trick is, well, how do we change that over time? We read it from a server or from a data structure, or somehow somebody typing it in or something, right? So more on that later. Okay. And actually, we do need the assignment though. There we go. So working with functions. All right. So one of the big changes in the ES6, right, in 2015 was how JavaScript uses a function, right? So there's a legacy version of functions that has been around, since its inception in the early 90s, still there, right? Widely used. We're using it, right? This is the old function syntax. Okay, we could absolutely be using the new and improved, right, arrow function syntax. But for components like this, I prefer the older syntax. Right, only when we're using, in a tight loop, or you have a lambda function, things like that, or like an event handler, then I'll use the newer arrow function. So let me show you the difference between the two syntax, right? And so let's create a component for it, and there it is, and create a function for it. So it says a function. And don't forget to export it. There we go. So let's look at the old functions, right? So let's copy that and put it in there. And so here's a function that we're declaring called add. And yes, you can declare functions instead of functions. So functions in JavaScript are treated like any other variable or any object, right? They can be passed around. You can attach data to it, right? They can be muted, right? And so here's a function, and I'm just calling it, right? I'm calling it here 2 and 4, and it just returns the addition, right? The arithmetic addition of 6, right? And it's printing it out, and then here we have legacy, blah blah blah. 2 plus 4 is the variable that we computed here, and the add, and or I can call functions right inside of an expression, which is pretty cool, right? So this would render as you would expect, right? So this is ES5 functions, and this right, and then so legacy functions, blah blah. 2 plus 4 is 5, is 6, right? To add 2, 4 is equal to 6, which it works, right? So there's no big deal of using functions, right? You can just declare a function, call it like parameters and whatnot, and just return. Yes. So the big change occurred, right, in ES6, the new syntax for arrow functions. Let's take a look at them. They're pretty cool. So the ES6, it uses a completely different syntax, right? For instance, it drops the function keyword. No need for the function keyword. Also, it replaces the keyword function with the arrow, right? And whereas the function keyword goes before the parameter list, the arrow function goes after the parameter list, right? But other than that, right, they can be interchanged. I could implement this function either using the function keyword or using the arrow function, right? But there are more fundamental differences between the two, right? The more visible change, right? It's that they can be, or I mean, they're already shorter, right, to declare, right? They're much more compact, but they can become very, very compact, right? In certain situations, and that's what I'm going to try to illustrate in the next several examples, right? The other big difference between the two is the interpretation of the keyword this, right? We're not using the keyword this in any of our exercises, but I did want to point out, right, that the way this worked in the older syntax was very unintuitive, right? And people hated it, okay? Because usually especially coming from the object-oriented world, the keyword this always was a reference to the current instance object that you were in, right? Well, not in JavaScript. In JavaScript, it's a reference to the current function that you're in. So if you have a function calling other functions, right? Depending on which function you're in, the keyword this is different, right? It's the instance of the function that you're in, not the object where these functions were called from or anything like that, right? So this is developers hated it. Why can't this behave like in every other language, right? Well, in the new syntax, right, in the ES syntax, the keyword this behaves like you would expect, right? It is a reference to the current instance. If you're inside of an object that gets instantiated, this points to that object, right? And then you can reference any class variables that are declared in that class, right? So finally, if you use the new syntax, right, you now can use this keyword like in any other programming language. Okay. So anyway, so let's play around with the arrow function. And let's create a function called arrow function, and don't forget to export. Okay, and let's copy the body and let's paste it in there. So let's see. So unlike the ES5 function, which was declaring the addition function using the function keyword, this subtract is not declaring it with a function. Instead, it's declaring a constant. See that? And then it's assigning to that constant this function, right? So functions are treated like any other variable, right? And they can be assigned, they can be passed as arguments, right? So I am assigning a function value on the right-hand side to a constant called subtract. And then I can use subtract, right, as the name of that function, and I can invoke it. And the way this works is that these parentheses, they're an operator. Right? They're operating on the left side. They're checking to see, hey, am I being applied to a function? Yes. Right, which is assigned to this. So it asks, is what's on my left a function? Can it be called? Can it be invoked? And it says, yes, it is a function. Okay, and then I will pass it these parameters to that function, right? So you can apply the parentheses on anything that is a function, right? And we'll see examples of that, right? So other than that, right, we could have just, call this function subtract, right, open curly bracket, right, and return. It would behave the same way, right? But we're using this new syntax, right? And the reason is that it makes it, it gives us lots of opportunities, right, to write very concise code, in certain situations. Right? And it improves readability quite a bit, right? So arrow functions, let's see how it behaves. There it is, arrow function. Yeah, new ES6 arrow function. So they behave like other functions, yeah. Right. So let's look at one of the first things that using the new syntax buys you, right? One of the new features is that you have what are called implied returns, right? And what it means is that if you have really, really simple functions that just return a single thing, just a small little blurb, some addition or whatever, right? You just have a one-liner function, right? If that's true, then you can drop the return keyword, right? And so it would be an implied return, meaning you are returning whatever that algorithm is computing. Right? You don't need the return if that's the only line of code in your function. Let's take a look at a couple examples. So let's create a component out of this. So implied return. So this is a implied. So this is a function. Oops, function imply return. And let's export it. There we go. And let's copy the body. So here's a function, multiply. We could have written it, we could have written it like any other function, right? This could have been, I'll do it with divide. So divide, right? So this is a function, you have the return. So this is a very simple return function, right? A function that has only a single line of code. And it just calculates the division between A and B. Yes? Well, because it's a single return, right? The multiply is also, we could also, have a like that, right? A return like that. And so these two functions are equivalent, right? They both just have a single return line, right? But because that's true, we can drop the return. We can drop the curly brackets and just write that. See that? Arrow and then A times B, right? And this behaves as you would expect, right? There's no need to return. There's no need for anything, which looks funny here, right? And but this syntax really shines if you have a little function that is part of a bigger expression, right? And you have to do a quick computation, right? Maybe like a map, a filter, right? And a reduce operation. right? This syntax is really, really nice. Right, when it becomes so terse, right, so small and compact, right, without the need of those extra characters for curly brackets and the return, right, and all that. So yeah, so then we're using it here to multiply 4 times 5, blah, 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 and we can display. Now, I didn't give you the body, the display, but my AI, yeah, there we go. See that? My AI is nice enough to create a small little blurb to display my content, right? So yeah, so let's go back to my JavaScript and add it here. So there's implied.
Recording in progress.
Oh, hello?
Hello?